Okay, welcome everybody to the annual Castan Centre Conference. My name is Sarah Joseph and I'm very proud to be the director of the centre. Let me first start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to thank, first of all, our major sponsor of today's proceedings, the law firm Cause Chambers Westgarth, and indeed I should thank all of our sponsors, and I will do so at the end of the day, but for now you will see the sponsors who are listed in the packs and on the program for today's proceedings. Another thing I should mention is that we do have some journalists here today from the student organisation Right Now. It's called Right Now. And during the breaks today, they will be seeking to interview people, not just speakers, but people who are here today. We would encourage you to speak to them, but if you don't want to, please don't feel obligated. Comments may be published on their online publications, but of course they'll seek permission to publish those comments. So please feel free to make comments. We would encourage that, but you're not under any obligation to do so. Before we start this first session and I introduce our speaker for the first session, I guess this is Human Rights Year in Review, ostensibly the last 12 months. And I guess I just wanted to start with a personal reflection that in my opinion, it does seem to have been an unusually remarkable 12 months for human rights. I think probably from a human rights point of view, one of the most profound events has been the so-called Arab Spring, with the largely peaceful protests which have succeeded in Tunisia and Egypt in overthrowing long-term dictators. Possibly has already succeeded in Yemen. It's difficult to know what's going on there, at least in getting rid of a long-term dictator. The sheer fortitude of the people in Syria who continue to get out there and largely peacefully protest despite the very real lethal force that they are opposing, or that will be used to oppose them. And then, of course, we have a very real war, a very controversial humanitarian intervention going on in Libya. We also have, as we'll see later on today, the International Criminal Court somewhat coming more to life with indictments. We had President al-Bashir of Sudan, well, certainly more than a year ago, but then more recently the indictment of Colonel Gaddafi, his son, and at least one other member of his government. Indeed, we've seen also more recently, it really has been a year, in fact 6 months, for the fall of some very, very powerful men. I mean, we've seen the leader of Tunisia, Ben Ali, the leader of Egypt, Mubarak. And it might seem a long bow to go from Mubarak to Rupert Murdoch, but I think it has been a truly spectacular fall from grace for someone who I think 12 months ago many people would have said was possibly the most powerful man in the world, or at least one of them. And even though this whole scandal, which does involve gross invasions of privacy, a human right of privacy, even though this scandal's been building for quite some time, it's really been since the revelations about the murder victim Millie Diyala, which was less than 2 weeks ago, that has really kicked off quite a spectacular fall from grace for Mr Murdoch, at least in the UK. Closer to home, or at home, we've had, unfortunately in my view, more hysteria over refugees and asylum seekers. This will culminate, from the sounds of things, on Monday with an official Malaysia solution. I won't comment on it. I gather that the UNHCR presumably is going to sign off on it. But either way, I think the escalation in rhetoric has been disheartening and, in my view, disgraceful. Very close to home, we have an ongoing review of the Victorian Charter of Rights and Responsibilities, which will hopefully be strengthened and certainly hopefully not weakened. It has also been a year of great socio-economic deprivation and brought about by natural disasters, which have then had human rights consequences, probably mostly in the form of economic, social and cultural rights. I refer to the Queensland floods. the Christchurch earthquakes, the tsunami in Japan, and it's easy to forget, but I remind you all that the Fukushima nuclear disaster is still ongoing. It's still not under control. And then, as revealed in the last few weeks, devastating drought and famine returning to southern Somalia. So those are just some of the issues which I think have arisen in the last 12 months, and of course we'll be looking at other issues, probably touching on some of those, but throughout the day. So let me now turn to our first session and our first speaker, Mr. Michael Thurston, who is the United States Consul General in Melbourne. And he arrived in Melbourne in September 2008 to serve as the Principal Officer at the US Consulate General. From September 2007, for a year prior to his arrival in Melbourne, he was the team leader of the Diyala South Embedded Provincial Reconstruction Team in Diyala Province in Iraq. And prior to this, he has served in Rwanda, South Africa, Ethiopia, New Zealand, Washington DC, Sri Lanka and Mexico City. Mr. Thurston is a graduate of the University of Washington in Seattle and also the University of Washington School of Law. He has served as a Deputy Prosecuting Attorney for King County in Seattle. He served in that position for more than 5 years before joining the US Foreign Service in 1988. His topic this morning will be corporate social responsibility and the right to connect to websites, to the internet and to each other. Can you please welcome Mr. Michael Thurston?
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Monash University and the Castan Center for the opportunity to address you on this topic. In particular, I'd like to express my appreciation to the Center's Director, Professor Sarah Joseph, and to the Administrator, Janice Hugo, for the kind invitation and generous assistance that they've provided. Today, I'd like to discuss the importance the United States government assigns to promoting global corporate social responsibility and internet freedom. The growing interconnectedness of the two issues and the concrete efforts by the U.S. State Department and partner organizations to achieve those objectives. It is especially appropriate to talk about the corporate social responsibility here in Melbourne, which is emerging as a global leader on the issue. And last November, the United Nations announced that Melbourne would be one of its worldwide headquarters for corporate social responsibility. And that's thanks in no small part to the hard work of Andrew McLeod and the Committee for Melbourne. And I remember talking to him about this, what he was trying to achieve here in Melbourne, and it's very nice to see that, in fact, he has succeeded. This initiative will establish a cooperative network of more than 7,000 companies from around the world, closer to 8,000 actually, to share expertise on community investment and philanthropy. This is an achievement Melbourne and Australia should be very proud of. The U.S. government is a strong promoter of corporate social responsibility, not simply because it's the right thing to do, but because it's also the smart thing to do. As Secretary Hillary Clinton has said, investing in our common humanity through corporate social responsibility and socially responsible development are not marginal to our foreign policy, but essential to the realization of those goals. Socially responsible companies are global ambassadors, both to other people and their governments. They are our first line of diplomacy. More people will do business with American companies, use American products, than will ever meet an American diplomat, a development worker, or a soldier. Often American companies are the face America shows to the world. That is part of why the State Department not only advocates for American businesses, large, medium, and small, but promotes best practices as well. Businesses that aren't being run sustainably cost governments and citizens money. Economically speaking, unsustainable Businesses bring down their country's GDP, create instability, and increase the number of people who require aid. In environmental terms, unsustainable practices lead to degradation, pollution, long-term health problems, and costly cleanups. Finally, regarding human rights, the absence of responsible corporate behavior can reinforce the worst tendencies of authoritarian regimes. Businesses are therefore an essential partner in reversing trends that threaten all of us. Government cannot solve the most pressing challenges alone, whether it is climate change, non-proliferation, or poverty. The goal is to mobilize businesses to align their income goals with solving these problems. And we're simply kidding ourselves if we don't recognize that corporations often have as much, if not more, influence on the future of the planet than many nation states might. Give you one example, just to give you a sense of that. The Gorgon project on Barrow Island alone is a $42 billion project. If it were a country, that would be roughly the 78th largest GDP in the world, larger than the entire GDP of 112 other nations. With these concepts in mind, the State Department established the Awards in Corporate Excellence, or ACE. We like an acronym. To recognize the critical role that U.S. businesses play in advancing good corporate citizenship and democratic principles. U.S. companies are nominated by U.S. ambassadors throughout the world based on achievements in areas such as innovation, responsible environmental stewardship, exemplary employment practices, and contributions to the overall growth and development of the local economy. As a recent example, Mars Incorporated was selected in 2010 because of the company's special relationship with the cocoa farmers of Ghana. Mars has supported the Sustainable Tree Corps and helped it in developing the Cocoa Livelihoods Program to evaluate the cocoa sector of Ghana and other regions. Mars works to raise awareness of the importance of reducing child labor and protecting workers at every level of the cocoa value chain, from the fields to the factories. And by 2020, Mars has committed to certify its entire cocoa supply, all 250,000 tons a year, as sustainable. Another 2010 winner was Cisco for its work in the West Bank, an area viewed by most companies as a no-go zone. Instead, Cisco saw an opportunity and invested $10 million in Palestinian programmers. And by including both Palestinians and Israelis on the same programming teams, Cisco has taken people and economies that are too often kept apart and reconnected them in person and in cyberspace. I'll elaborate a little bit further on Cisco's work in my remarks a bit later. I saw for myself firsthand what corporations can do if they come aboard, and not always because it's the right thing to do, but sometimes because it's a smart thing. As Consul General in Durban, South Africa, I was there when we implemented one of the largest aid programs in U.S. history, and that was the program to combat HIV/AIDS in South Africa. KwaZulu-Natal, which is where Durban is located, had the highest infection rates in the world at that time. I would talk to corporations and talk to them about doing things like testing, counseling, treatment, developing clinics for their workers. Initially, many of them saw no value in that. But once they started losing trained workers, once it started costing them in real terms to have to continually retrain people to do the jobs that they were doing, they then saw the value in it. We saw any number of corporations, and I was very proud to see that the American corporations were leading the way. Some of the automotive industry there that's located there, in starting programs to test their workers, provide counseling, provide treatment as necessary, and in quickly expanding it to their families, understanding that it had to include more than just the workers themselves. That was a remarkably successful program that had a real impact in the community. And that's what corporate responsibility can do. Obviously, it also assisted them in their bottom line. They were now keeping workers healthy who could continue working for them and not going through a continuous program of retraining and investing in new workers over and over and over. It was cheaper to actually do the right thing. The U.S. government is also a strong supporter of a number of public-private initiatives to promote best practices in support of promoting transparency, development, and human rights, particularly in the area of oil, gas, and mining. Now, I'm going to be using a lot of acronyms as we go through this, so I'll apologize in advance. One example is the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, which were established in 2000, and provide guidance to extractive companies on maintaining the safety and security of their operations within operating framework that ensures respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. The voluntary principles are backed by governments, corporations such as BHP, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, Rio Tinto, and NGOs such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Oxfam. The principles seek to help companies on key operational issues such as carrying out assessments of human rights risks, engaging with conducting human rights screening of public and private security forces, and developing systems for reporting and investigating allegations of abuse. Another example is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or EITI, which is a coalition of governments, companies, civil society groups, investors, and international organizations aiming to strengthen governance by improving transparency and accountability in the extractive sector. With good governance, the exploitation of oil, gas, and minerals can generate large revenues to foster growth and reduce poverty. However, when governance is weak, it may result in poverty, corruption, and conflict. The EITI supports improved governance in resource-rich countries through the verification and full publication of company payments and government revenues from oil, gas, and mining. U.S. support for this initiative is reinforced by financial reform legislation that was passed in 2010 that included a landmark provision that requires energy and mining companies registered with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to disclose how much they pay to foreign countries and the U.S. government for oil, gas, and minerals. Similarly, the United States has launched what we call the Energy Governance and Capacity Initiative, or EGCI, which provides a wide range of technical and capacity-building assistance to the host governments of select countries that are on the verge of becoming the world's next generation of oil and gas producers. So Papua New Guinea in this region is a good example of that. EGCI's core objective is to help these countries establish the capacity to manage their oil and gas sector revenues wisely for the benefit of national economic development. EGCI also supports a broad range of U.S. foreign policy objectives, including ensuring the security of global oil and gas supplies, supporting clean energy goals by maximizing the efficiency of oil and gas resource development, furthering political and economic stability in developing countries, promoting democracy and human rights, and combating corruption. As I said before, doing the right thing is also often the smart thing. I'd now like to switch to the issue of internet freedoms. In a February 2010 speech, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called for a global commitment to internet freedom to protect human rights online as we do offline. This is based on the premise that the universal rights of individuals to express their views freely, petition their leaders, worship according to their beliefs, and to assemble and associate are just as valid in cyberspace as in a public square. Taken together, she referred to these rights as the freedom to connect. In the year and a half since that speech, events across the globe, most notably in the Middle East, have clearly demonstrated the prescience of Secretary Clinton's words, from Tunisia to Egypt to Syria to Iran. Use of the internet helped advance political, social, and economic change. Sadly, in some cases, it was also used as a means to stifle or extinguishing that change. As with new technology, the internet has the capacity to both enhance and degrade the human condition. In China, the government censors content and redirects search requests to error pages. In Burma, independent news services have been taken down with distributed denial of service attacks. And in Cuba, the government is trying to create a national internet while not allowing their citizens to access the global internet. For the United States, on the spectrum of internet freedom, we place ourselves on the side of openness. We are supporting the development of new tools that enable citizens to exercise their rights of freedom, free expression, by circumventing politically motivated censorship. We are providing funds to groups around the world to make sure that those tools get to the people who need them in local languages and with the training they need to access the internet safely. In the last 3 years, we have awarded more than $20 million in competitive grants to support a burgeoning group of technologists and activists working at the cutting edge of the fight against internet repression. This year, we will award more than $25 million in additional funding. We are taking a venture capital approach, supporting a portfolio of technologies, tools, and training, and adapting as more users shift to mobile devices. We have our ear to the ground, talking to digital activists about where they need help, and our diversified approach means we are able to adapt the range of threats range of threats that they face. We support multiple tools. So if repressive governments figure out how to target one, others are available. And we invest in the cutting edge because we know that repressive governments are constantly innovating their methods of oppression, and we intend to stay ahead of them. Last year, the United States Department of State launched Civil Society 2.0 to build the technical capacity of civil society organizations to accomplish their missions through the use of connected technologies. Civil Society 2.0 seeks to match these organizations with technology tools and tech-savvy volunteers to help raise digital literacy, strengthen the information and communications networks of NGOs, and amplify the impact of civil society movements. In September 2010, the Secretary launched the M-Women Initiative, a public-private partnership led by Global Women's Initiative designed to close the gender gap in mobile phone adoption. Monitoring and responding to threats to internet freedom has also become part of the daily work of our diplomats and development experts. Our embassies raise the cases of imprisoned bloggers, journalists, and online activists at the highest levels of government. And we take a public stand on their behalf. In the last year, we publicly raised the cases of online activists and journalists in countries ranging from Egypt and Tunisia to Azerbaijan, Syria, and China. The State Department also continues to advance internet freedom as an economic issue of multilateral forums, and will continue to advocate for openness on the internet in our bilateral relationships. We are committed to continuing our conversation with people everywhere around the world. Earlier this year, we launched Twitter feeds in Arabic and Farsi, adding to the ones we already have in French and Spanish. We'll start similar ones in Chinese, Russian, and Hindi. This is enabling us to have real-time, two-way conversations with people wherever there is a connection that governments do not block. At the same time, the United States is actively supporting the freedom to connect. We recognize that the open internet comes with challenges. In a follow-up speech this year, Secretary Clinton highlighted a number of these challenges, starting with achieving a balance between liberty and security. We need successful strategies for combating the threat of terrorism, extremism, human trafficking, cybercrime, and child pornography, without constricting the openness that is the Internet's greatest attribute. So we're investing in our nation's cybersecurity. We are cooperating with other nations to fight transnational crime in cyberspace and helping others build their own law enforcement capacity. The second challenge is protecting both transparency and confidentiality. The Internet is a public space with the power to make information of all kinds available instantly. But it is also a channel for private communications, whether it is for governments, businesses, journalists, activists, or ordinary people. There must be protection for confidential communications online. The existence of connection technologies may make it harder to maintain confidentiality, but it does not alter the need for it. A third challenge is protecting free expression while fostering tolerance and civility. The Internet can amplify the speed the dissemination of intolerant, hateful language, as well as provide a space for people to bridge their differences and build trust and understanding. The United States does restrict certain kinds of speech in accordance with the rule of law and our international obligations, but we don't restrict speech even if the majority of people find it offensive. And when it comes to online speech, the United States has chosen not to depart from these time-tested principles. In the end, it comes down to choices. And the choices we make today will determine what the Internet looks like in the future. Governments have to choose to live up to their commitments to protect free expression, assembly, and association. People have to choose how to act online, what information to share, and with whom, which ideas to voice, and how to voice them. And businesses have to choose whether and how to enter markets where Internet freedom is limited. Which brings me to the final portion of my remarks, the intersection of corporate social responsibility and the freedom to connect. When countries curtail Internet freedom, they place limits on their economic future. The young people don't have full access to the kinds of free inquiry that spurs people to question old ways of doing things and invent new ones. Barring criticism of officials makes governments more susceptible to corruption. Freedom of thought and the level playing field made possible by the rule of law are part of what fuels innovative economies. If you invest in countries with aggressive censorship and surveillance policies, your website could be shut down without warning, your servers hacked by the government, your design stolen, or your staff threatened with arrest or expulsion for failing to comply with a politically motivated order. The risks to your bottom line and to our integrity will at some point outweigh the potential rewards, especially if there are market opportunities elsewhere. Now, some have pointed to a few countries, particularly China, that appear to stand out as an exception, a place where Internet censorship is high and economic growth is strong. Clearly, many businesses are willing to endure restrictive Internet policies to gain access to those markets. And in the short term, even maybe in the midterm, those governments may succeed in maintaining a segmented Internet. But those restrictions will have long-term costs that threaten one day to become a noose that will restrain growth and development. In 2010, for example, we saw Google, one of the world's most innovative and respected firms, make the courageous decision to discontinue the censoring of search results in China after experiencing a sophisticated cyber attack from inside the country. While Google remains strongly engaged in China in a number of other areas, its position in the search engine market has dropped significantly. And earlier this year, the company claimed the Chinese government was blocking its free Gmail service. In an increasingly interconnected global economy where long-term prosperity depends on not just manufacturing, but the innovative use of the internet, picking fights with companies like Google is bad for business and economic development. It is therefore no surprise that in the past year we have seen the emergence of a global coalition of countries, businesses, civil society groups, and digital activists seeking to advance internet freedom. We have found strong partners in several governments worldwide, and we've been encouraged by the work of the Global Network Initiative, which brings together companies like Google, academics, and NGOs to work together to solve the challenges we are facing. Challenges such as how to handle government requests for censorship, or how to decide whether to sell technologies that could be used to violate rights, or how to handle privacy issues in the context of cloud computing. We need strong corporate partners that have made principled, meaningful commitments to internet freedom as we work together to advance this common cause. But corporate social responsibility in this area is more than just dealing with authoritarian regimes. It is also about advanced firms using their technological skills and innovation to advance broader goals of peace and prosperity. Which brings me back to the example of Cisco in Israel and the West Bank. 3 Ramallah-based Palestinian companies originally began working with Cisco as part of a $10 million it pledged for corporate social responsibility. The funds provided training, equipment, and a direct communication link to Cisco in Israel. The companies quickly began developing 5 R&D and software projects that involved real business. Cisco gave these companies the opportunity and the exposure they needed to demonstrate that Palestinian companies can compete in the global marketplace and that the Palestinian economy is open for business. Cisco also worked with the Palestinian Authority to fund other projects such as youth centers, specialized training, and most recently, a venture capital fund that will focus on the Palestinian technology sector. Cisco's work has helped to create a personal connection between Israelis and Palestinians. Technology bridges the gap between Netanya and Ramallah and provided the first positive interaction many of the young developers have ever had with their counterparts on the other side of the Green Line. Cisco also launched the Digital Cities Projects, between the predominantly Jewish city of Upper Nazareth and the predominantly Arab adjoining city of Nazareth. Using advanced internet technology, the project provides concrete tools to improve relations among the Jewish and Arab residents while promoting tourism, healthcare, education, and civil services. Their NetAt program encourages teenagers from disadvantaged communities to become leaders in the technology field through advanced technical skills and a complementary social leadership curriculum that reinforces commitment to community. Since 2003, NetAt has graduated more than 2,000 students in Israel. This program has been so successful that Cisco has used it as a model to launch another pilot program, Mediterranean Youth Technology Club, in neighboring Middle Eastern countries. Finally, Cisco's Israel's Women's Empowerment projects have promoted the inclusion of more women in the ICT industry 2 pilots were established, one for Jewish women in Netanya and one for Arab women in Baka el Garbra. 600 women have graduated from this program so far, and 65% of them have found high-quality jobs in the sector. Those are the kinds of corporate initiatives the United States and other governments should encourage and reward. In closing, we need to remember that Internet freedom isn't about any one particular activity online. It's about ensuring that the Internet remains a space where activities of all kinds can take place. Quoting Secretary Clinton, "This is one of the grand challenges of our time. We are engaged in a vigorous effort against those who we have always stood against, who wish to stifle and repress, to come forward with their version of reality and accept none other. We enlist your help on behalf of this struggle. It's a struggle for human rights, it's a struggle for human freedom, and it's a struggle for human dignity." Thank you.
Very much for that. We now have just about 20 minutes worth of questions before we have our first break. I might kick off with one question before I throw to the audience. Just on Hillary Clinton's she's done the 2 speeches, but particularly her 2010 speech. There has been some criticism of that speech on the basis that perhaps Hillary Clinton was kind of signalling that the internet and internet freedom was becoming a tool of US foreign policy, and that this might have led, unduly spooked other governments such as Russia or Iran or Cuba, and might have prompted governments to crack down on the internet more than they would have if she hadn't been quite so blunt about this being in US foreign policy interests. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Listen, the governments that want to crack down on those things are going to do it with or without comments we make. I don't really see anything out there that would lead me to believe that is added to it. We believe it's important. We believe it's critical, and we have to speak out about it, and we have, and we will continue to.
Okay. There's one in the middle. Lizzie, by the way, there are roving mics, so please wait. So there's one just in there, and then there's another one on the side here.
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thurston, for coming to speak to us, and I'm particularly appreciative of the position you put forward about openness on the internet and the US government's support for that. But with respect, I find it a touch disingenuous given the US government's position on WikiLeaks in particular. That's an organisation that has come to epitomise internet freedom, and I'm particularly making reference to the accused whistleblower in relation to Cablegate, Bradley Manning, who's currently being held in solitary confinement. How can you justify a position of openness on the internet and opposition to censorship and still run what I think is a campaign of repression and stifling of an organisation like WikiLeaks, which is so greatly associated with the power of the internet for everyday people to know more about their government and the opportunities that the internet offers to offer greater transparency and accountability in government?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that's the same issue. The U.S. has not tried to close down any internets. We have not tried to stifle what's on the internet. What we're concerned with is stolen material appearing on the internet, material that was not authorized, and no matter who or how they got it, if it's stolen material, it remains stolen material. It's a different argument philosophically if you believe that there should be no secrets or everything is publishable, but then that means if everything's publishable, that means things about personal details about individuals that might threaten their safety. All those things are out there then, if you believe that. I don't see that the two cross. I don't see the inconsistency. What we're concerned with is the possibility of material that was unauthorized, having been stolen and put out there. No one has tried to go at the New York Times, whether it's their online version or their hard news copy version, and stop that publication. That's very different.
There's one on the side.
Mr. Thurston, thank you for your talk. The first questioner took my question, so I'll ask a slightly different one, which is that it's fantastic that you're funding initiatives to help people circumvent repressive government's attempts to censor the internet. And given that the Australian government's about to introduce the most repressive internet censorship laws in the world, do you think some of that US funding will be available for Australian people to try and circumvent those repressive laws?
I don't think we had Australia in mind when we came up with that sort of funding. And what Australia, you're having a debate about that right now, and that's a debate for you to have. And you'll make those decisions based on what the Australians think is the best way to go forward. And I'm pretty confident in the Australians' ability to speak up for what they believe to be the freedoms that they think are worth having out there.
I might just quickly interject with a slight follow-up on the WikiLeaks question, and just if you could just expand on why the New York Times, which is effectively publishing the WikiLeaks cables, so the stolen material, and in many cases publishing them before WikiLeaks has. What is the fundamental difference between the two, with some fairly strong statements from the US government that it is, at the very least, extremely disapproving of WikiLeaks, and yet no such statements about the New York Times or the Guardian or some of WikiLeaks' newspaper partners?
They're the news, and when they get something and they put it out there, that's up to them. We don't censor, we don't stop the news. That was tried once before, if you remember, with the Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, and that went up to the Supreme Court. And that was quite a while ago. And it's the right of publication. Once it's out there, it's out there. And no one has gone to the New York Times or any of the online sites or any of the newspapers and tried to abridge their ability to publish what they have. We have asked, taking a look at it, try to be responsible because people's lives are put at risk. It's an easy thing to say that everything that a government does should be transparent. Well, I don't agree. There are a lot of people in repressive regimes. There are people in governments and in countries that I've worked in that have talked to me privately to tell me about things that are going on, that abuses that aren't generally being published, that aren't generally showing up because it's a repressive regime or the government just doesn't want it out there. And they're saying, look, heads up, the following is occurring, whether it's corruption, whether it involves trafficking in people, abuse of women. Those people aren't going to come and talk about it if they know that, okay, by the way, if I tell some other people about what you've told me, you'll be identified. So we learn less about these sorts of abuses. We learn less about the sorts of corruption and other issues that we'd like to be able to address if people can't come forward and tell you about it without some assurances that they're not going to show up in some sort of a publication identifying them, or at least enough information so that they can be identified and that they're at risk. I mean, that's just one example. I think there are a lot of examples, whether it was working with the former Soviet states to try to get control of a lot of the nuclear material that was out there after the Soviet Union came apart. Should we put all of that work online so that everybody knows where all this material is, the fissile material, where it's the weakest, where it's the most vulnerable, so that terrorists know where to go? Should that be out there? I think the answer is no. I think most people would say the answer is no. I think that there have to be certain things that need to be guarded and that need to be protected. And I have a lot more confidence in systems that may not be perfect to try to regulate that. We have elected officials whose job it is to determine levels of classification or what can be classified or what should not be classified. And if you think those officials aren't doing their job, well, you have the opportunity to go to that public official and vote them out of office, or certainly express that you don't think they're doing enough to have more transparency, or there's too much classified material. That's their job, to intervene in those things, not individuals who aren't accountable to anybody to make the decision as to what should be out there and what shouldn't be out there.
I've got a question just at the...
Would you agree that there is a distinction between, not being transparent and not disclosing, and also between lying to citizens. I give an example. I was at in Geneva at the UN for the American UPR, and the American delegate used the exact phrasing, America has not and does not torture. And I think the whole room basically scoffed at that, because we can basically say that that's a lie. We've seen the evidence of that.
I take it you have a strong position.
Yes, I do. So, okay, I can agree with you in sometimes it's not reasonable to disclose, but I don't agree. And what's your position on blatantly lying to the citizens and saying...
Well, first of all, when you start with a question, would you agree? That always kind of gets me like, okay, what's up next?
Okay, sorry, no.
That's perfectly fine. It's a good question.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I can only tell you that this administration, first of all, I don't know when that statement was made, and I'm not there, so I can't verify it. But the Obama administration has made very clear its position on any forms of coercive action to get questions. The use of that information that you get in subsequent hearings or trials is not allowed, and those things do not occur since this administration has taken over. That's one of the early things they did. So I don't know that that statement was incorrect. I don't know the context. So it may not, in fact, have been incorrect. To lie. The Ellsberg Papers were very interesting. The Pentagon Papers were very interesting because they disclosed information that was completely at odds with statements that were being given by some officials, very clearly at odds from the public position. I haven't been seeing that in these purported cables of WikiLeaks. I haven't seen that sort of thing. This to me does not rise to that level of the Pentagon Papers. That was very different, and it just doesn't rise to that level, not to me. Thank you for the question.
I might ask, when people ask a question, it might be good if they could identify themselves. I think there's a question up here at the back.
Thank you. My name's Tessa Scrine, and I convene the Australian Forum of Human Rights Organisations, which is a network of about 50 NGOs in Australia working on human rights. I wanted to ask you, and perhaps it's a little bit outside the topic of your speech exactly, and clearly the policy of the US to support internet freedom and these connections is a good one and positive in a human rights context. But what are the policies of the US then to defend people who are prosecuted and persecuted even as a result of exercising these freedoms? I'm thinking, for example, of Iran, where young bloggers are frequently imprisoned, often tortured, and in notable instances killed, sometimes executed, sometimes mysteriously dying in prison. To read the blogs in translation of these people is quite a heart-rending experience because they're just expressing basic human desires for freedom that all of us would wish to be able to experience. And clearly it's not just the US support of internet freedom that leads to this. But I just wondered if you're able to speak a little bit about how the US sees its role in defending the human rights of those who then seek to exercise these freedoms.
Well, what we can do in Iran is obviously pretty limited. What we can do is, when those come to our attention, we publicize them. We talk about it in the open where we can. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you have to address these issues more quietly. But where we can, we talk about it publicly, very publicly. We castigate Iran for that kind of behavior. Short of that, it's tough to think of other sorts of things we can do. There are already a lot of abridgments and curtailments of economic trade and other sorts of things, and their banks can't operate outside, and that sort of issue that's been taken pretty far to indicate displeasure with a lot of their activities. But short of making sure that people outside of Iran know that this is going on and who these individuals are, where we know who they are, we try to do that. But short of that, I'm not sure what. Maybe you have a suggestion. What do you think we should be doing short of publicizing those names and bringing it to the attention of the world?
It's actually something I've previously spent a lot of time thinking about, what the role is.
I'm sure it has.
And
very clearly from your question you thought about it.
And it also, I think, and maybe it's an interesting discourse to have, but I think the question too for those of us that defend human rights is, what is our role? How do we engage with this as civil society in these sorts of questions? Is there a role for civil society actors in this arena that you're talking about? I mean, maybe that's a question for us and not for you, but...
I think there's a role for everybody. I don't think that we should just rely on governments for these issues. If we think they're right, then there's a role for everybody. And there are a lot of very active NGOs in this area, in this field, human rights and others, who try to do what they can in that area, in that field. And I think that's terribly important.
Okay, we've got a question on the right here, and then another one right at the back.
Peter Clark, the Victorian Bar. It's hardly... the internet's becoming a form of asymmetric warfare, which is a relatively recent development. For instance, Russia shut down Estonia's internet connection, and it's no secret that large countries such as China and America have devoted a lot of money to determining what, if anything, they can do through the internet in the event of military escalation. Now, in that circumstance, it does pose the question for a country like America, what conventions would America apply to any involved invasive or covert actions, either military or through surveillance, to differentiate between legitimate targets and those of the innocent, for instance, hospitals, individuals, in the event of a escalation of hostilities to whatever level?
That's not a question I'm really qualified to answer. I know that we take it seriously. I know that our former Secretary of Defense recently stepped down. Gates spoke about that issue and the importance of being able to act in that area, because it's a very real threat, and how certain types of cyber activity would be viewed as an aggressive act if it's traced to a particular country. How technically that they would differentiate which sort of cyber attacks or this, that, or the other, or how they respond, that's not something I can really respond to. I don't know that we have an interest in going after hospitals. That's not typically something we're interested in. But that goes more to the values that you hold in your society as important, rather than the broader question of how do you respond to a cyber attack and what do you do in return. That's not something I can really answer. I'm not qualified.
Okay, I've got two more questions, and I think that's probably going to bring us to an end. So one at the back and then one over here.
Thanks. Adam Macbeth from the Castan Centre. Thank you very much for your talk. You gave us quite a frank assessment of the policies of a number of countries with regard to internet freedom. So I was wondering what you might say about a country, hypothetically, let's maybe call it Conroivia for the sake of argument, a country which maintains a blacklist of individual websites determined by the government and mandates a filter prohibiting anyone from accessing those individual websites. What would you have to say about a country that maintained a policy like that?
I would have to say that that's a dangerous hypothetical, because I suspect that it's not a hypothetical. So I don't know. I can't deal with that. If you have a particular country you want to talk about, I can try to respond. I may or may not be able to answer you, but
it's a proposal. It's not something that is
and where
currently
is it
done. It's a proposed model.
Where?
Yeah.
Okay.
Australia.
Well, yeah. Well, again, my answer would be the same. That's something for Australians to debate and discuss. Look, Australians are pretty open society. You value things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, as highly as we do in the United States. So in the end, you're going to decide. Your elected officials will decide the way to go on that. That's really not for me to comment on, and other than to tell you I have a great deal of confidence in ultimately what Australia is going to do.
Okay, and there was one just on the left in the centre here.
Thank you. Natalie Mobini from the Australian Baha'i community. And it's a question really about language, I suppose. You used an expression a number of times earlier in your talk, which we hear, in many different places, that 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 doing the right thing is often also the smart thing, and that that's a case that can be made to corporations. And I can see that in specific cases that's sometimes a very useful argument. But I worry sometimes when we hear it about what it implies for the cases when doing the right thing to do is the dumb thing to do, and whether it's not somehow, in fact, weakening the moral argument if it's no longer sufficient to just say the right thing to do is the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I puzzled about that sometimes when I was in South Africa working with companies and trying to get them to come up with or work with HIV/AIDS sorts of programming, because we thought, working with South Africans together on this, we thought, hey, that's the right thing to do. It's your society and it's the right thing to do. Well, unfortunately, not everybody saw it that way. And while those who weren't seeing it that way were not taking actions, other companies were, their workers were suffering. Their workers weren't being tested, weren't being counseled, weren't being given treatment. Their families weren't. And so down the line, big chain there, people were suffering because someone didn't want to do the right thing. What we saw as the right thing, obviously it's a little subjective. But in the end, I was a lot more concerned that those workers got the treatment and got the attention they needed. And if the company couldn't do it because it was the right thing to do, I just wanted them to do it because it was the smart thing to do. And that meant alleviating the suffering of a lot of those workers, getting them and their families the counseling and treatment they needed. Because I don't think that on the end of it, the families who were finally getting treatment, getting the drugs they needed, or getting the advice and counseling they needed, I don't know that they were really concerned with whether their employer was doing it because it was right or because it was smart. They just knew that their suffering was being alleviated to some extent. And to me, that was the better thing to do. And in time, hopefully the company will come around to thinking, yeah, this is really a good social policy and this is something we want to be involved with. But for me, in that setting where you needed to immediately do something, if you can't, it was very clear. If you can't do it because it's the right thing, do it. We would show them why it was the smart thing and do it for that reason.
Just as a final question, and kind of following on from that, in your talk you mentioned quite a few initiatives of the US government to sort of promote corporate social responsibility kind of in the form of carrots. Would the US government ever support, if you like, sticks, international regulation or regulations which sort of make companies be more socially responsible, to take into account those companies that don't think it's smart every now and then to do the right thing? So sticks rather than carrots.
Sure. No, that's not really for me to say. That's up for the president. That's up for the legislature. That's up for those folks to discuss and decide what they want to do. But I can tell you, we have, for example, in one area that has worked, we have very strong the Foreign Corruption Practices Act, where when we have found out, and we have found out, that U.S. companies were involved in what were believed to be corrupt practices overseas, might be paying authorities under the table, whatever it was, there have been prosecutions. Companies have paid the price. People have gone to jail. Foreign companies that had connections to the United States and may have committed those acts not in the United States have also been prosecuted successfully under that act. Again, for some of those companies, in fact, some people complain, well, if they can't compete on the playing field of others, that is, being able to do these things that we see as corrupting, then it's not fair. Well, sorry. We just don't see that adds to good governments. Corruption, in fact, is one of the most destabilizing things that I've experienced in my time working in Africa or other places in terms of trying to help a burgeoning democracy. So we have things, U.S. laws, that have been used successfully and gone after pretty large corporations.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just on that last law, it has been in the news a little bit recently because some people have been mooting that it could be used against at least James Murdoch for allegedly corrupt payments in trying to shut down this hacking scandal. But I digress. This brings this session to an end. Before we thank our speaker, I'll just inform you morning tea will be just outside until 10:45. We will commence the next session right on time at 10:45. But for now, can you please join me in thanking our speaker, Mr. Michael Thurston?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting.